So that's terrific. Thanks to four speakers. I'm going to ask the speakers to come up to the front of the room, and we'll have time, about an hour actually, for a Q&A. I think I'm going to stay here if that's okay,
While
Jeff.
I do that, I want to, just for the first time, probably not the last, thank everybody. Mike, can you put the slide? Thank you. That's the list of the planning committee, so I want to acknowledge everybody who worked hard to make this day happen. You'll hear from almost everybody on that list at some point during the day. And then the next slide, maybe the most important list of people who work here on the staff at the National Academies. Of course, these kinds of events can't happen without the hard work of the staff. So there they all are, Sarah and her colleagues. So thank you all in advance, and we'll say thank you again at the end of the day. Thanks.
Okay. So 4 really interesting, stimulating, provocative talks. I'm going to ask some questions for the panelists. So Michelle, you made a very provocative statement that data scientists, and I'll take a liberty of maybe saying AI researchers, are in ethical adolescence. I'd like the others on the panel, particularly Deborah and Suchi, the scientists, to comment on that, and also ask all of you to comment on current activities that you know about to try and have discussions of the ethical issues be part of the be part of the training and ongoing work of data scientists and AI researchers. Deborah, do you want to start out?
Did you see you were in front of me, so you didn't see my visceral response. So I really appreciate the point. I think it's super important. The particular individuals, and I know you know this, and I think Pilar made this clear, right? It's the context in which they have come to their adolescence. It's the incentives of the companies and all of that that's come about. So I don't so much put it on the individuals, which, right, in terms of, because some of them are actually past adolescence, right? In terms of their maturity, if you take them in the context in which they grew up with a set of norms and behaviors. And it's the combination of what you said, and I think what Pilar said, that makes them, now they and their companies with those incentive structures having to do with scale and frictionless and all of that, and you take that incentive structure and the people who have come to professional maturity and a sense of confidence in one context, and somehow now they're in a context where we can't just do that translation. So I completely agree with the point and the context, and I think we need a combination of professional ethics and law that brings us to correct where these incentives are, and it's very difficult.
You missed that part of Michelle's talk, I think. You want to? But go ahead. Why don't you comment or ask Michelle to repeat?
Yeah, my assertion was that unlike PhDs in social or natural sciences or physicians trained in medicine, data scientists have not typically had as part of their training an acculturation in ethical norms, and that therefore they may be somewhat rudderless.
I would definitely agree with Deborah's comments that I think on the optimistic side, though, I would say in the last couple of years, I've definitely seen change, very, very positive change. The good news is, I think, and again, I'm not hopelessly optimistic, so don't point me as that, but I would say, really, really good, strong people often end up going in these engineering fields, which means they learn very fast if they're pointed in the right direction. And so to me, it feels like 2 very concrete things we can do differently are sort of change the way we educate in order to bring these ideas. And I mean, again, in almost all of the, not even almost, maybe all top conferences and top meetings in our field now, there's very significant parts of the agenda now focused on ethics, bias, transparency, fairness, and then also there are like whole meetings now dedicated to it. So the good news is I think there's been very, very strong corrective action very fast, but I still think we could do a lot more to, to sort of bring about both better education and also handle this through the law in certain cases.
Pilar, and then Deborah has more comments.
So I also would say that I have a fair amount of optimism. The way I got into this whole field was writing a grant proposal for a BD2K center with a bunch of people from our computer science and bioinformatics departments. And then I spent several years leading the ethics core of our BD2K center and learning and being really immersed with data scientists. And one thing I saw was a huge appetite for discussing ethical issues. We did a fair amount of programming around it. We brought in ethicists, we brought in lawyers, and so forth. And our programming was well attended. And the upshot was that I was asked to develop a class, an ethics class for data scientists. So this is our third year teaching that class. It's now oversubscribed. We've had to put a limit on the number of people who can participate. Engineering, biomedical engineering, our biostats department, some of our bioinformatics and our public health, they're making our class mandatory for their students. So, and our class is basically developed around case studies from the time we spent with the data scientists. So we spent a lot of time interviewing people, trying to elicit from them what their ethical issues were, and then we built cases around that. And so I see, and I'm also one of the people who has come to various data science meetings to give the bioethics talks, if you will, and I see really a lot of hunger. And I also have to say that it's really a pleasure to work with people who have engineering and computer science backgrounds, because once you present, ethics as this is a problem-solving exercise where you have certain constraints and you're trying to solve your problem within those constraints. Like, that's what engineers and computer scientists do. And so if you don't present ethics as, like, here are some insoluble dilemmas, right? But as problem-solving activity, then they realize, like, they have skills, right? They have skills that can translate into this space, and they get really excited about it.
Yes, so at the risk of being cynical just on that last one, my father raised me, cynicism is cheap. Nevertheless, sometimes it's that you also give them new publication directions, right? You can start whole new areas, and they get excited about that. I have too, I do as well. It's one of those things. So I agree with you, both of you, that it is wonderful and it is increasing, and seeing your tutorials and such, there's wonderful things coming to the academic environment to train these individuals and raise the level of that conversation. But I worry that it is all going to die when it hits the market, when you can't get venture capital funding for your startup, or you can't launch a big product or in joining a larger company, if there is no law and regulation and things that shift the incentive structure. I mean, there are other contexts in which I, just as a layperson, find the healthcare system not particularly ethical. Why don't you deal with nutrition in a more fundamental level, right? And there's something in the incentive structures that have guided where we are decades later and the way our healthcare system looks, right? That makes it look out of whack to somebody like me, again, as a layperson status. And we need to do something now to align things so that these people who are now trained to want to do it can actually build products that do it, because they don't scale as well, they introduce more friction, et cetera.
Well, I'm also encouraged by the amount of activity. I come from Stanford, where we pump out a fair number of data scientists, and there's a new presidential initiative at the campus now to bring ethics to students in computer science, and the response, as Pilar said, has been overwhelming. So that's great, but I sort of think of this as having 3 stages of maturation, and I think we're still in the first one. I think the first stage is recognizing that there are ethical issues, getting them out on the table and starting to talk about them. The second one, which I think we're just beginning to enter, is actually having a framework for people in the profession to think through those problems. A framework that is shared, that is a cultural norm that people identify with personally, and enables them to actually solve those problems. And every profession has faced having to develop that. Medicine, law, natural sciences, public health, we've all had to do it. And I think that's just beginning, and that's what's needed. And then the third step, as Deborah was saying, is having some traction for that framework in the leadership of companies so that we are not training people to go out and do things that they're not going to be allowed to do.
Several of you in your talks made the point that transparency is important. Deborah, you said it's really important if you're talking with someone on an app and it's actually a chat box, not a real person. You should know that. I assume that if an AI algorithm is driving a recommendation for your care as a patient, you should know that it's not just your doctor, but she's working with a computer. Just want to ask the question of, does transparency really mean anything? So I get my care at the University of California, San Francisco Healthcare. They're trying to negotiate a contract with one of the large companies to basically transfer everybody's data for big data analysis. It'd be great. It would enable people who develop their algorithm at Northwestern to see if it applies on the West Coast. It's really a take it or leave it proposition. If I get my care there, I have to use the electronic record. I don't control what the institution does with data about me. So question, should I have some control over that? Should I be able to opt out? If not, is transparency just a false window dressing? Does it make me feel better to know that they're going to take my data and use it for secondary purposes, use it for commercial gain, and so forth? So what do you all think?
So first of all, I think that people can experience that kind of thing as very exploitative, right? And we have some data on this in other contexts that people don't experience the way their data are used by commercial entities that are using their internet click data, for instance. They don't experience this as, I've made a rational trade-off to get the benefits of whatever website I'm using, and in exchange, I'm giving you my information, right? They experience that as they're being exploited and often feel like life today is such that I can't do without Facebook, for instance, especially if my company uses it or family members use it and so forth, that I can't really do without it and have a full life, just like I can't really do without my health care. And so they don't feel like they have a choice, right? So that's about the actual norm that we're applying and whether we think people should have any control, right? I think notice and transparency is better than no notice and no transparency, in part because it allows people potentially to engage in various kinds of political activity around what the laws and norms should be, right? So I think it's better to have transparency than not to have transparency. With respect to trustworthiness, it's still better to let people know what you're doing than not. But I just don't think it's a solution to the deeper problems. And in particular, also transparency without data governance, right? Without official processes for understanding how you transfer those data to the commercial context. So first of all, the idea that you're just gonna vend it and walk away should be ridiculous, right? No, you should license it and you should keep some control in that license over the kinds of uses that that commercial entity can do. and, over like quality assessment. And I think that's a very open frontier, what that set of relationships should be.
A platform for sharing data on an Android platform that gives control of personal data to the user of the platform. Do you want to talk about that and the whole notion of allowing people the choice, which would mean the choice not to share, even if the healthcare organization wants to?
Yes, but first I wanted to respond more directly. So a different colleague of mine, Kurt Cole, CIO at Weill Cornell, has a group of people working on a kind of, I probably shouldn't be saying this, sort of a 10 commandments for data sharing. And so I'm mostly doing this for attribution because this comment is what I've learned from talking with them. Just wanted to double down on what you said, which is that this notion of that you would sell data and then relinquish responsibility and relinquish those norms that you've come with, right? So the idea that you might collaborate as a health institution or a clinician with a company might well, but you retain responsibility and you bring your norms to that sharing. And I think it's a very, very, very important a point of distinction, because you retain the responsibility and the norms and that process. Next topic. A much smaller topic at the moment is data sharing when it comes to individuals. Again, if you're at a part of an integrated healthcare system, there's really not clear why you need something other than the portal by which all your healthcare systems see it. Many people don't have that cohesiveness in our healthcare system. So HealthKit, Apple introduced HealthKit that you would, and using the great work that's been done by the FAR community to have standardized ways of downloading your clinical data so that you could have it and transport it, and also possibly inform as applications emerge that actually do something useful and responsible with your data, that you could have that include and come directly from your health record. So Common Health, a nonprofit out of the Commons Project, is developing the same thing for Android. We've done this before around just wanting to keep parity between for people who can't afford iPhones or for people who can but choose not to use them. And so it does the same thing for Android. Now, we do not have Apple's App Store by which they're curating and reviewing all the apps that would get access. So what do we do in this messier context of Android, which is sort of more like the US as compared to Finland? Sorry if that analogy doesn't make sense. But and what do we do and what should we allow? And there are those who would say that to be frictionless and to allow the most innovation in the startup community, you want to basically allow the same kind of informed consent or uninformed consent that come with standard terms of service. And some of us just, do not see that as sufficient. We have plenty of empirical evidence that that isn't sufficient. So what do you put there instead, in terms of having it be that UCSF or Weill Cornell or Columbia, right, could create, or Mayo, right, could create their could approve applications that individuals are using that would have some kind of an oversight around that data, including that data doesn't go anywhere else. There is no data selling, data brokering, and data reuse. So that's just all in context. It's a conversation in context. You're interested, I'll be happy to introduce you to JP Pollock, who's running that process.
So you use the term collaboration, and I think that's the context in which we're most comfortable. And there are many academic institutions that have initiated collaborations around some of their data with for-profit companies. But I think one of the problems comes from the fact that a lot of this is not really going to be collaboration, not for any bad reason, but because, an Alphabet or Microsoft might have an interest in using the data and going in some direction that nobody in my radiology department actually has an interest in or expertise in doing, right? And so one of the difficult things is, how do you find that middle ground between just transferring the data and walking away, and a full-blown collaboration, right? And that's where I think we really need to think about what the data governance should be, because I can see that there will be valuable uses that these companies can make where they can develop something outside of a full-blown collaboration. And so I wouldn't necessarily want to limit data sharing to that context, but.
So I want to pose a follow-up question, if I may, to the two scientists, Suchi and Deborah. To go back to the question of should you allow individual patients to opt out of their institution's decision to share, transfer, sell, whatever verb you want to use, data with a Google or an Amazon or IBM Watson. Would allowing opt-out undermine the ability of researchers to test the validity and generalizability of, say, a machine learning algorithm? Suchi, you presented a very nice overview of sort of a life cycle of AI machine learning. Derivation, generalization to other institutions, and then follow-up after it's been implemented and perhaps practices change over time. Would allowing a certain percentage of people to drop out of those large data sets, I guess it might matter whether or not they're randomly distributed or they're special people who have particular concerns about sharing data with the commercial company. How does that play out in the ability of scientists like you to really attack this as an engineering problem that needs to be solved?
So I can't say, I can only give an approximate answer because I haven't thought through it very, very, very deeply and fully. But I would say my 90% answer is very likely. I don't think so first, I definitely think individuals should have the option to opt out. So again, this is my 90% answer because there are corner cases maybe I haven't thought about. But I think individuals should have the ability to opt out. And I don't believe that individuals opting out is going to really present an enormous problem technically to our infrastructure or the ability to learn or the ability to validate. So I think the main challenge there is sort of institutional infrastructure in being able to opt out, but I don't think that's a very big lift either. So in fact, almost a lot of the institutions I do visit, like healthcare institutions I do visit, I see, explicitly an informed consent piece form that I have to sign that says, do I give my data or not? And if I like my physician, I give them data. But if I think it's a practice I can't trust, then I'll say no. So I think that is already the norm. To me, the bigger concern is more about sort of this example I see outside of healthcare. I grew up mostly with the internet. So to me, when I see something on the internet, I don't see it as the gospel. I'll read it and I'm like, oh, whatever. But sometimes my parents see it and they are so alarmed by it and they'll send me forwards of things I need to do to protect myself or people who are coming to get me. And so that's just totally different norms, right? They grew up in a time when whatever you read was just true versus that's just not true for us. So what I see is a lot of differences. I think it's to me, a lot of it is about the timing in which we happen to exist, where technologies change so fast. So when I go onto Facebook, and I don't mind it. Everything I'm typing, I understand they will use my data. I have no problems with it because I am getting all that service in return. I do not want to pay $1,000 to use Facebook. I'm completely fine by being able to talk to my parents for free, have this wonderful service where they're 8,000 miles away and I can connect with them in exchange for them using my data. And I trust that they, So I think this is very cultural and the norms are changing. And to some extent, I think, so I do think informed consent should exist, but to me, the bigger problem is education. You can have all the consents in the world, but I don't know if most people I know how to internalize it and understand what does it mean. And I think many of them see it as exploitative as opposed to thinking of it as, the pros and the cons and, what are the benefits I get. Either they're sort of they don't care, they're apathetic, or if they care, then very often they care in the form of I'm being exploited, which is not great at all. We get a ton of services right now that we don't have to pay for, in part because the infrastructure enables it, and these are good services.
Okay, while we're waiting for other comments from the panel, we're going to open it up to the audience for questions. So if you have a question, please come to one of the two mics on the side and let the panel finish commenting on this one question.
First of all, I'm a technologist, not a scientist. I expect my legal scholar colleagues might be more scientists than I am. So just thank you for that, Bernie, but correction. I think that opting out, of course, should be right. Completely agree with that, Suchi, but it's just insufficient because most people, particularly in the panic of whatever it is, that's not what you're attending to. So we need our institutions to have the norms and behave responsibly, independent of what individuals said. So I don't want to have the notion that people can opt out, somehow make it okay for the institutions not to have to do more. And I think we all agree on that. And then not having to do with what you asked, possibly not having to do with what this panel is about, but I can't resist. This free, because it's free, it's okay, is just not okay, okay? Why do we think that in a capitalist economy, which we have, that free, there are too many things that are wrong with free and frictionless just at surface, right? And because these things become part of infrastructure, right, we don't really have the freedom to not do them. And I think we lose all our power because we live in a capitalist economy as consumers. When things are free, we don't even have taking our dollar, our credit card, or whatever it is away from expressing our opinion. So I think that this issue of free will come in and does come into play even in the health context about in that, and I'm not sure what to do about it, but just needed to say it.
Okay. So just to correct that, sorry, Bernie, I do agree with you that in this capitalistic world, but I don't believe it's free. I think I acknowledge this is not free. I get something in exchange for giving it. I think it's just that I don't have the chance, I don't always have the ability to opt out. And having the ability to opt out would be great. Like, in some scenarios, I would prefer to pay $1,000 and have my subscription with no advertising, no use of my data. Thank you very much, right? But we're not always given that option. And I do agree having that would be phenomenal. I do want to say one more crucial thing, which is in healthcare in particular, I've had personal family loss where I've felt, darn it, if we had better systems that use better data more effectively, we could have saved those lives. But right now, I see a lot also of institutional leaders saying, oh, we shouldn't give our data to for-profit institutions for free. We should be getting paid for it. I don't believe the awareness there is, oh, let's protect our patients. I think the real thought process there that's going on is, how do we make sure we're not leaving revenue at the table by not giving our data to these third parties? So to me, it's like one bad for another bad. And I would love it if you could somehow shift all of this responsibility thinking about the patient and how our patients could benefit if we had better use of this data and more transparent use of this data. And I think patients would probably be more appalled at the institutional leaders who are safeguarding their data.
So I'm going to actually pivot and try to open this up to audience questions, but I am going to give the panel sort of a heads up. At the end of this, 25 I'm going to ask each of you to make some suggestions as to researchable topics that bioethics scholars and data scientists and computer scientists and developers and engineers can do as research projects, and that funders might want to fund as part of the grant-making program. But let's open this up. Alex, I think you were first up. Can you, just because it's being broadcast and because we are going to do a transcript, just state your name and your institution? I'm going to ask people to keep their questions short. Alex, please.
Alex Capron, the University of Southern California. I wanted to raise a question that has run through the assumptions that have been raised about the contrast between the healthcare system and the for-profit system. About 35 years ago, we had a panel at the Institute of Medicine on for-profit healthcare, and it was driven by the interest that Bud Relman, then the editor of the New England Journal, had in that, the real bee in the bonnet about it. And one of the things I think that emerged from that is that it was increasingly difficult to see the difference between the not-for-profit, university, et cetera, based healthcare systems and for-profit systems. And so I take with a little bit of salt this, the virgin is over here, and here's the horrible predator coming. There may be more resemblance there. I also wanted to pick up on something that Michelle said, and I totally understand the pushback. Engineers and computer engineers and so forth are now being concerned about the ethical issues that are involved. But I resonated with her starting point because for a good deal of time, the people I have talked to in this field have said that it didn't initially bother a lot of engineers when they were dealing with things which we think of as human subjects research, and they just saw this as data. And these data are not particularly things that worried them. And but I want to flip that around in a question to you all that has to do with how much are people that are doing what you're doing thinking about the effects of the new techniques on the way physicians will practice. We're clearly concerned that physicians may become dependent upon these interventions and having the answers supplied to them. And Bernie has raised the question of transparency. I don't recall the last time I had an interaction with a physician where the physician gave me her or his specific statistics as against the general. I don't think we have total transparency now, but at least the physician in that situation was the person who I thought, whose brain was thinking through my problem and I could interact directly. If it's in a black box, it's a little different. Do we degrade the expertise? When planes like that Air France thing go down a number of years ago on the flight over the Atlantic, the analysis says what had happened was the pilots didn't have the experience that their predecessors had, hadn't been learning all that time themselves. The learning machine had done all that and had taken over. And so when the crisis came, they weren't prepared. Our doctors, we began bioethics with Paul Ramsey and a concern about the patient as person. And the challenge there was not seeing patients just as diseases, but as persons. Are we going to get to the point where physicians also, this is a separate related problem, are seeing patients just as data?
Okay, quick responses from the panel. Who wants to, Michelle?
That was really rich, Alex. Thanks. I think in suggesting that that there's a distinction between how technologists think about ethical problems and how medicine does, I didn't intend to suggest that this was an absent problem in medicine, and that's why I put it in the category of old problems that have gotten worse and not new problems. I think there is a distinction, though, because while healthcare organizations, we've long had for-profit involvement in that sector, there is a bulwark there because they are staffed by physicians who have a different mindset, different training than the managers of those organizations. So there's, I think, to some extent, a counterweight within those organizations because of medical professionalism. That's not true in technology companies. I think your second point about physician integration with these technologies is really important. I also don't think that's a new problem. I think it also inheres in other kinds of decision support tools, whether it's clinical practice guidelines or automated decision support within EHRs. And of course, the answer has to be that you don't get to turn your brain off. You have to consider things outside the cookbook. And I think an interesting question is whether that needs to become more explicit in codes of medical professionalism, that there are standards for how physicians interact with digital technologies. I think part of the question is how you talk about it with patients. But again, it's not new. Just as my surgeon doesn't tell me, part of my thinking about whether you should have this surgery is that this decision support tool that I consulted ahead of time tells me this, or the last 100 patients that looked like you had the surgery and did well. I'm not sure that there should be a discussion of algorithms in the clinical encounter.
Okay, quick comment, Pilar, and then we're going to move on.
So I want to connect Alex's question to Suchi's point about education. So some of the people who need to be educated are the users who are clinicians or people in clinical laboratories, right? And so in order to educate them on how to use the algorithms properly, those algorithms need to be studied enough that we understand, that the developers understand the contraindications, how generalizable the data is, the algorithm is, for whom it is really indicated, right? We have to actually generate that knowledge before we can communicate it to the end users. So this goes back in part to my point about the regulatory system right now is not necessarily incentivizing that. So what will incentivize that?
Okay, Ben, state your name.
Sure.
for the
Yeah,
record.
Ben Wilfon from Seattle. I want to ask all of you about the comments you were making earlier about informed consent. And people seem to have a lot of enthusiasm for the value of giving people a choice to opt out of having their clinical data being used and shared with commercial companies. So I guess and I think this really could turn into a researchable question. So it seems to me, I'm curious to hear, though, without doing the research, what your own guesses would be about the answers. And so the two questions are, what do you think people would do if given that option? And second, what should they do? And I'm curious what so I have to say.
Most people won't do anything. My enthusiasm was, well, sure, allow for it, but that's just like completely insufficient because most people won't do anything. So I will call the question and say it's not that relevant of a question. We have to ask the question, what do institutions do, given that most people are not going to express their concerns that way?
Any other comments? Ben had a hidden question about, is there a researchable project that a funder should fund on this?
Well, I think there is certainly more we could do to understand how people think through opt-outs. You know, there are quite a number of studies based on just examining administrative data, de facto how many opt out of like a Care Everywhere HIE network or a clinical trial data sharing scheme. So, you know, the numbers are small, as Deborah has said, but they don't distinguish between people who are just inertial and people who have actually deliberated about the issue and made an informed decision. So I think there's a range of interesting projects that could be conducted informing people about the benefits and risks of participation versus opt-out and seeing how that impacts their thinking, and particularly focusing on racial and ethnic groups that are, we know, at higher risk for opt-out, and how to build trust in those communities.
This is, not well thought out at all. I'm just responding. You could do an experiment where you switch to opt-in and where you go back to individuals and ask them for data and see how hard it is to get the progress and the learning done.
I think just sort of understanding what they would do, whether if we give them opt-out or opt-in, to me seems like a very small part of the problem. The bigger problem is they just don't even know what they're being asked. They have no idea how to even go about thinking about it. And much bigger problem is that I think us as a society haven't formed an understanding of what is the right thing. Like, we've never done an analysis. It's mostly people understand status quo. What they don't understand is the counterfactual of not participating, of all the great things that could come out that doesn't come out or won't happen, or the thing that they're imagining, they're not imagining. So in the UK, for example, over the last year and a half, they've sort of done a number of national, they've invested nationally in educating, through a variety of different fora, the benefits, the harms, and, how the data could be used, and, what does it mean for the data to be used, and what are problematic things that can happen. And I think, frankly, doing that here in the US would be pretty amazing, that most people don't understand. So I hope the investment doesn't just go into informed consent research but more in terms of understanding a policy around moving beyond fear to what are the goods that can come out.
So, Ben, if I could maybe translate into researchable projects, it's understanding what people understand and don't understand about their options here, and then researching different options for presenting information and see if it improves understanding, changes the number of people who opt in or opt out. So I think there's a whole host of empirical studies that could be done.
And there's normative studies, too.
Yeah, okay. Dorothy.
Yeah, I'm Dorothy Roberts, University of Pennsylvania. First, I just want to say something quickly about Michelle's response to Alex's question, pointing out that there already are ways that doctors are using algorithms. One of them is race correction in medicine, where doctors use tests that are automatically produced, or the results are reported differently for Black patients, an automatic upward adjustment in glomerular filtration rate, for example. And I would highly recommend that as we're looking at new algorithms, we look at race-based corrections in medicine that's already going on and is under-examined. But my question was about the sources of bias, focused mostly on racial bias in algorithms, especially in predictive analytics. I didn't really hear that much, and I'd love for the panelists to talk more about the way in which structural inequalities that are embedded in the data that's being used produce these unequal biased outcomes. And it's really clear in predictive policing, for example, where law enforcement agencies are using data based on arrests to predict who's going to commit crimes in the future. And we know that arrest data are highly based on discriminatory police stops and frisks and their focus on African-American neighborhoods. So they're going to predict that Black people, or people who have the characteristics of Black people, are going to commit crimes in the future. And that's been shown through multiple studies. But that happens in medicine as well. And the study that Sushi mentioned with Optum, where you said it was human error, the error was actually because the data that were used were based on the fact that healthcare is structured to give inferior care to Black patients. So Black patients there's less money spent on them, and that wasn't taken into account by the people who created the algorithms. And so there's an example where structural inequality that already exists gets reproduced in the outcomes of these algorithms. And I wondered if you would say something about that. That's also, I think, relevant to what everybody was suggesting, that we need more collaboration, but it seemed like the collaboration was between people already in the medical profession and the engineers who are, created the algorithms. I think we actually need collaboration with people who understand structural inequality in society, like sociologists who can recognize these problems with the data that the algorithms are being applied to.
Comments from the panel?
So I, for one, would welcome that collaboration. So if you wanted to meet afterwards and talk about it, that would be wonderful. Regarding the specific example you brought up about Optum, so in that scenario, I called it, quote, human error, because the interesting thing there was that the algorithm was reproducing what was in the data, but in particular, it was not what was just sort of in the data blindly. It was that the algorithm was trained around a particular objective function. And the objective function was predict who are the people who are high utilizers or high cost. Instead, if they had said predict who are the people who are sicker or at risk for getting sicker, they would have gotten a totally different output. So it's more like the people who were designing the algorithm, who were designing that measure, weren't thinking about the consequences and the structural inequality that they were sort of putting in place by using choice of one objective function versus another. So
Yes.
the thing that the hope I saw in that was interesting was that, one, sort of noticing, like, this has been going on for 10 years. Well, guess what? Now that we're talking about bias and inequality, et cetera, now it's getting uncovered. Mm-hmm. So one, that because it was algorithmically this was being done, you could use the data, because the data now exists, you could measure it. Because you could measure it, you knew where you were wrong. And now the second cool part of it, I think, is that you can correct it probably in like 3 months.
Yes, but so I agree with you that it was partly because of the way the algorithm was designed, but that also supports my point that the designers of the algorithm didn't know about the structural inequality that Black people who are sicker get less health care, right? So that was the problem. They assumed an equal society, and it's not.
And we hope
Yeah.
that error shall never, ever be
Yes,
made.
yes, okay, thanks.
So I wanted to respond to this because I'm so glad you asked that question, Dorothy. Usually I go around and give like a 45-minute or an hour talk
Yes,
just on this topic.
sure.
And so when I realized I was at or near the end of my 15 minutes and I hadn't said one word about it, I thought, I really hope somebody asked this question. So yay, thank you. And part of what I think this is the most ethically difficult and interesting problem related to machine learning. For me, it's the most interesting and difficult ethical problem. And I always think of it as there are those social inequalities that are patterning the data, things that happen outside of the healthcare system, right? Then there are things, I sort of think about access as, so the nature of people's insurance, the, actual doctors who are within reasonable distance of them and accessible to them in other ways beyond insurance. Those access questions, I think of them as the overlap of the healthcare system and society. And then there are things that happen in the healthcare system, right? And I believe it's maybe JAMA. There's one of the big journals right now has a whole special issue on racism in the healthcare system. So there are inequalities that are being created within the healthcare system that will be reflected in the data. There are patterns, there is structuring of the data because of access problems, and there's structuring of the data because social inequalities become embodied, and then people with those embodied inequalities walk into the healthcare system, and appropriately, the healthcare system should respond to their health needs, right? But figuring out which kind of inequality it is, I think is difficult, and I think algorithms, if somebody can get under the hood the way that Obermeyer Group did, algorithms might be very helpful, machine learning might be very helpful in identifying certain kinds of inequalities and helping us to respond to them. On the other hand, this was in use for 10 years, and nobody thought to test it, and oh, by the way, a lot of times it's really hard to do that once these things become commercialized because they are not sold. They are licensed, and they're often licensed with particular restrictions on how you can study them, right? And they are, the people who develop them keep the data as trade secret, for instance. So one of the cool things about this study was that they actually got access to the underlying code and the underlying data, and so they were able to discover the problem. Yeah, so I'll just stop there because I could go on for 45 more minutes.
Last question. Let's keep the question and the responses short, because I do want to hold the panelists' feet to the fire. We can't hear you very well. Here's your mic. I'm going to ask the question to be brief, the comments to be brief, because I want to come back to this question to the panel of researchable topics that funders can. So if you've got a favorite proposal you or a colleague has, this is the time to air it. There are funders in the audience.
Thanks, Bernie. My name is Camille Nebaker. I'm at UC San Diego. Thinking about what we've been talking about from a regulated research ecosystem, and we've been talking about both regulated and unregulated. So within our traditional environment, we've mentioned education as being a critical need. And I think about the research participant not having adequate research literacy, data literacy, technology literacy. First question is, how would we fund research to improve literacy across those areas so informed consent could even be a potential? With respect to researchers doing this work, we have a data literacy problem and data management problem. Within IRBs that are reviewing this work, we have a literacy issue. So we need to educate across the stakeholders. I'm really curious about what kind of funding opportunities, research questions, should it be embedded, should it be separate? And then when you think about educating the students who are going to work in the unregulated sector that may get ethics acculturation but go into an environment where there is none, how do we have questions that will address that gap? And is it even possible? Thank you.
Deborah? Good.
So, important questions around literacy, and I think that's an area that can and should be pursued. But I'm going to come back to the previous comment that I also worry about literacy being used as an excuse for institutions not to be safe and responsible. So I want both.
Anyone else? Michelle?
Well, I actually think literacy might be the easy part. I mean, I think that we will, in very short order, develop training programs for computer scientists in ethics and for ordinary people in digital citizenship. My children get it already, starting in the 3rd grade in school, a variety of digital citizenship training. I think the harder part is salience. So, we can have all of this information in our heads, but the bombardment of consumers in everyday life with the opportunity to consider and make decisions, I think, is just cognitively overwhelming. So expecting people to be able to marshal and be interested in marshaling this information, the 10 times a week we have to check those boxes online about whether we consent to data, I think that is a much bigger ask of people.
Okay, so I'm going to ask.
Can I want to just
Quick,
add
quick,
one
quick.
quick thing to this, so agree with everything that's been said. And also, with respect to educating providers, I think there's really interesting work going on. For instance, Duke has this thing where a group at Duke has developed basically an information sheet about an algorithm. So they put it in the format that information, like prescriber information, is formatted for clinicians. And the idea being that but instead it's information about an algorithm. And so it has things like the contraindications, recommended use, it has all that same kind of information, and it's a way of quickly and concisely communicating the most important things to the users. And I think more work of that sort is needed to understand how best to communicate with the users and to educate them about how to use these things.
Okay, so not so subtle transition to turning on the gas for funders. So Pilar, your point could be made into a researchable study. What's the impact of informational interventions like that on endpoints you care about, and you can randomize the doctors? Suchi, why don't you start with giving us a researchable project that you would like to see funded?
So I think an area that I see is very exciting is the ability to design metrics and tests to be able to measure whether an algorithm is biased. So in other words, biased, so you might ask, well, what does that mean? That means we have to define, like, biased in what way, biased with regard to what scenario, and the research question itself will explore, both setting up the scenario and setting up tests and metrics. And the reason this is so important, I think, is because in areas where we've been able to quantify things, the expectation that in every scenario we will have access to proprietary code and the proprietary data set, and especially as data sets evolve and algorithms evolve, that any point in time we can go and spend a huge amount of human labor testing it is just sort of too ambitious. But if we had ways to develop tests, just like we do in any other part of software engineering, that could run and measure and detect likelihood of bias, then that's really cool because we can really focus our energy. Then I think there are some really promising ways to do that. We're sort of, that then would lead also to automated ways of correcting, detecting, diagnosing bias.
Next, let's go next project. Deborah?
I didn't read the full email telling me to prepare for this question.
It's off the cuff. Think on your feet.
I have two suggestions. One is outside of my wheelhouse, and I think more interesting once somebody articulates it better, which is following on your call to, or somebody's call to, that we need these, both of those questions from outside the room, that these needs these social constructions in the room alongside the technologists and the clinical scientists. And so if we look at that work, right, it came out of also from Senthil Mullainathan and a behavioral economist. And I think that if we could look at some of these cases that we now have, Suchi mentions many of them, and look at the things that worked in ways that we're not happy with. We can all sit in a room and say, we're not happy with that outcome, but they came about for a reason. The reason the optimization function was about cost was because it was a company that needed to implement something to address costs. It wasn't some random shift in that. And so institutions and companies at some level rely on regulation and law to keep them having optimization functions that can both pursue revenue and do the right thing. So can we somehow take these cases and work backwards from them and look at where the minimal amount of regulation, law, incentives might have caused the right thing to happen? So I'd like to learn from the data we have to some extent. And then the other, I think just a much smaller one, but more in my wheelhouse, is that as we look at giving individuals access to their health records so that they can help to take agency and pursue specialized care as needed, how do we build that to be full of friction and yet useful? And so I would really welcome people who would like to think about that problem, where we start with introducing useful friction that still leads to good patient outcomes.
Suggestions for research projects?
So I'm totally with Sushi on this one. I actually have worked with some researchers at UW who write algorithms to assess the fairness of other algorithms, right? And they actually have algorithms that can not only assess the fairness of other algorithms, but give input into the training as it's happening to steer them toward a fairer outcome. Now, there are contexts in which it is much easier to do that than in many healthcare contexts, right? And so one of the things that is interesting for me is to figure out what the right metrics are, what the right metrics are for assessing the data sets and how they change before cleaning and after cleaning, so that, you know, during cleaning you might be dropping out way more people of color, for instance, out of the data set that ultimately is used to train. But if you don't have metrics for assessing that, you don't know. So, you know, some things like that, but also for me, like, I have found really fruitful collaboration, not so much with empirical research, but with scholarship, in thinking about, with my computer science colleagues, about like different theories of fairness and how different theories of fairness apply, how they can get instantiated into a piece of software. Why should you choose one theory of fairness over another theory of fairness, right? It's actually like not philosophically straightforward. It's not technically straightforward. And so it's really interesting for all of us, I hope.
Michelle?
Yeah, I'll throw out a couple of ideas, but first, since I have the last word, I just wanted to thank and publicly credit Jeff and Bernie for convening an all-female panel on this topic. I think, yeah. In 20 years of doing these things, I think that has happened 0 times, and certainly not on a technology topic. So we noticed. We thank you. Yeah. So 2 suggestions. One, I think, is for studies that explore pilots of these alternative approaches to individual-informed consent. For example, some institutions now use data use committees that are groups of experts and community members to evaluate particular proposed uses of health data. How do those groups work? What are the pitfalls and promises of that approach? How do the results the results compared to what individuals would choose for themselves, and how do their group deliberations reflect or not reflect the views of minority communities. I think that's one important area. And the second, and the data point that I feel the absence of most acutely in the work that I do, is this question of intergenerational shifts in conceptions of privacy, and more broadly in the acceptability of the trades that we all make every day online of our personal information for goods and services at low or no cost, because I do worry that we are setting in place rules that make sense to our generation but don't for those who come after us.
Okay. So each of you gets one last take-home message that the audience is going to remember forever and ever. Deborah, you want to start? What's the take-home message? Or you can pass and go around. Pilar, take-home message? No? Sushi?
So I guess my take-home message is that there is an incredible amount of both research and intellectual work and scholarship to be done here. And that work needs to be done in a very broadly interdisciplinary way.
I am really excited about all the different disciplines that are already coming together to make it happen, and I hope there will be funding to concretely facilitate some of the research ideas we're talking about today.
I would echo Pilar's point that we don't want to try to fix these issues in post. My husband works in tech, and he's always talking about cleaning up his mistakes after production is fine, and the reasonable approach. And I completely agree. I think it was an excellent point that we want to be getting out in front of these ethical problems before these things go prime time.
Deborah.
And all of the previous, and just to be realistic about what the incentive structures are in the context in which these things get deployed.
Okay. Please join me in thanking our panel.